Well, the haters gonna hate, 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 and the fakers gonna fake, 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 baby. I'm just gonna making luck, a Dominion podcast. Hey, while you're on your break, if you want to play some Spirit Island, I'm down.
Did you cut out?
Nice.
No, I literally think you cut out. I didn't hear you.
Okay. Point taken.
No, there's no point taken. I actually didn't hear what you were saying.
Sure you didn't. So anyway,
I wish that people could hear my audio if you published this so that they could know I'm not lying.
Welcome to Making Luck, a Dominion podcast.
A Sekiro Shadows Die Twice podcast.
Yeah, a That Thing podcast. A cleansing podcast.
A Why Can't Jake Climb Out of Silver in Overwatch podcast.
I hate it when that happens.
By the way, anybody who's listening, stuck in silver. If you want to carry me, I'd be happy to get into gold. Yeah.
So this is a Minisode.
Yeah.
And the reason it's a Minisode is because Jake needs a break.
Don't we all need a break?
Well, that's true. Yeah.
Yeah. So. Just for Dominion, I think it's healthy, and I think that we're gonna do an episode on this pretty soon.
Probably the first one when you come back. We'll include that topic. Yeah.
I'll have a fresh perspective.
Yeah.
Fresh,
of course, spelled PH with a capital H.
Yeah, exactly. And just to sort of preview that a little bit, I will say that I was starting to get to the point where I wasn't having as much fun, and that's happened to me in the past. And what fixes it for me is just not playing Dominion for a week or two. So maybe if you're getting there, that'll help you out too. So if you start to get annoyed by things like your page missing the shuffle, stuff like that.
Yeah, page is stupid. Missing the shuffle is stupid.
Shuffling cards.
Yeah.
It's dumb.
Yeah, it's a dumb mechanic in any game that has... Yeah.
So, Adam, what have you been up to?
Well, my life is consumed by the baby. Any time I'm not spending on the podcast is spent with the baby. You would think that means I'm sleeping more, but that doesn't ever work out.
I would not think that means you're sleeping more.
Oh, okay.
I think that means the baby is sleeping a lot, and you are... he's sucking the sleep out of your life.
I mean, he does that regardless of the podcast, though.
Right.
But he's cute enough, so we let him do it, I guess.
Yeah, he certainly can intake a lot of semi-solid nutrient paste.
Yeah, and he can certainly output a lot of semi-solid paste.
Right.
Full of different types of, quote, nutrients.
Well, they wouldn't be nutrients unless you were able to remove the pathogens, in which case it would actually be edible.
Yeah.
I'm not even kidding. Japan put out this product.
What?
I'm not even kidding. They removed all of the pathogens in fecal matter and sold it as something you can eat in case you've ever wanted to have that experience. And it's just one more thing Japan did, and the rest of the world is, okay, you proved to us you could do it, but nobody asked. So your move, I guess.
Wow. You know what? Every podcast I learned something, Jake, and I'm glad that this wasn't an exception.
Let me find you the link.
Well, we'll include it in the show notes, apparently. So anyway, this is going to be a mini-sode, and that's largely because, the plan is I'm going to try and do an episode or two with Wandering Winder, while Jake is taking a sabbatical from Dominion and by
learning
extension
all kinds
the
of
podcast.
fun facts. Yeah.
Yeah, about Overwatch and dying many times or something. But Wandering Winter's pretty busy, and rather than delay this episode by, I think, 2 days, which is what would have to happen, I figured we'd just do a mini-sode now, and next episode will probably be a normal episode with Wandering Winder, and then we'll play it by ear from there. We may have some more episodes with Wandering Winder. We may have another mini-sode or two, and then Jake will probably come back at some point and rejoin us for the podcast with his hashtag Fresh Perspective.
Hashtag Fresh Perspective.
Yeah. So we'll have an episode here, a minisode from the Wandering Winder series of minisodes, which is more theoretical in nature, but it helps you think about stuff. And next episode, I believe we have a couple of things we're kicking around. We're not quitting. Jake's not quitting, and I'm definitely not quitting. But all those professional podcasts, they take some time off, and
Yeah.
I think we're getting to the point where we're like legitimate enough where we can take some time off. What do you think?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, there are times where all the podcast and related stuff to it does kind of feel sometimes like a second job. I mean, it's a hobby, like we enjoy it, like we choose to do it, but like, man, there is a lot, and you take vacations from your job sometimes.
Yeah, that's why we have a backlog of content so that we can
Yeah,
just do this when we don't feel like it or we have something come up. And I think I think it's just a testament to like how serious we take the podcast and really how great we are. What do you think, Jake?
yeah, I think we're pretty great.
Yeah.
Yeah, you, me, Wandering Winter, and Parker, all
Yeah.
four of the podcast hosts.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and
The,
Lexi.
those are the only. Yep, that's it. No one else has ever even been on the podcast in any way.
Right. Whatever happened to good old Hoppy?
He's fine.
Whatever
He
happened to
was.
him?
Do you
Man,
want do you want a real answer to that question, or you just want to pine about it?
wonder.
Okay.
Are we ever gonna hear from him again?
I mean, I'm
Huh.
going to his wedding later this year. Does that count?
What a shame
Yeah,
that
we hardly
what
knew him.
happened to that guy. Rip.
Yeah, he's with Harambe now. Don't worry.
We'll miss you, Hoppy.
South Parade Hoppy.
Out.
Anyway, enjoy the mini-sode. We'll almost certainly have a regular episode next week. And thanks for listening to the podcast.
Yep.
Making Luck Minisode. Wandering Winder back with another Making Luck Minisode. And previously we had talked about the what I called the whole deck paradigm. And if we remember the money density paradigm, the output of a money density deck, the output of a money deck or a deck that's working in that regime, that paradigm, is based on the average money content of a card and then multiplied by the number of cards in your hand, which should be around 5 for that kind of a deck. And that gets you the output for your turn. And then in the previous episode, we talked about this other paradigm, the money dense, not the money density, the whole deck paradigm, if I can talk right. And the whole deck paradigm, right, the amount of output your deck has when you draw it is just the total amount of economy in your deck. Obviously, though, you're not going to get that every turn because some turns you don't draw your whole deck, even in fairly well established decks that can draw pretty well. So if your average output is the output of your whole deck times the percent reliability of drawing that deck, then obviously it makes sense to try to figure out how reliable these decks actually are at getting drawn. So the total amount of cards that you can draw in any one turn obviously is going to have some effects on how likely you are to be able to draw your deck. If the total number of cards you can draw in a turn is less than the cards in your deck, then well, obviously you're not going to ever be able to draw your deck. And I think some people I've even seen don't realize this because they've been building their deck along ho hum la di di, and they don't realize that they've added more payload cards and or green cards and or junk to their deck without properly adding more draw ability to their deck, and they can't actually get through their whole deck, and they don't realize it because they have been for several turns now, and then they can start complaining about how unlucky they are, and in fact that's not actually unlucky, that's just poor deck building. if you're trying to draw, 20 cards and you only have 3 smithies and 4 villages, you're not going to be able to get there. So that's one thing. Now, how much you can draw also makes a significant difference. If you're drawing exactly the number of cards in your deck with villages and smithies, think about it for a second. You have 3 villages, 3 smithies, that's 12 cards plus your 5, that's 17, like we talked about earlier. If you have a 17 card deck, how likely are you going to be able to draw your whole deck? The answer is actually very unlikely. You're less than 50% in a case like this, and generally in cases like this anyway. And what's up with that? Well, the issue is, if you think about it, the big issue there is that at the end of your draw, if one of your last 3 cards is a smithy, then you can't have played that smithy to draw those 3 cards, and you're not going to draw your deck. So the chances of having at least one smithy in your bottom 3 cards in a 17 card deck are pretty substantial. If one of the last few cards is a village that you need, you're also going to be out of luck. And this is on top of dudding out earlier in the turn. So all combined, basically, if you're just barely drawing your deck and you're just trying to do it based on having the right number of villages and smithies, it's not going to come together very often for you. And to some extent, this is intuitive to people. If you think about early on in the game, if I just start buying a few villages and a few smithies, then yes, it's possible for a turn to come together where you draw everything already. But if you open village smithy, village smithy, village smithy, nobody's really going to think, oh yeah, I should be able to draw my deck most turns, even though technically at that point you can draw it all. So that's one thing. Having overdraw by even 1 or 2 cards makes a big difference in this respect, though, because it starts to get a lot less likely that the last cards of your deck are what's holding you back. And actually, here's important point number 2, and that's to say, if you only have a very limited number of payload cards and you don't draw all your drawing cards, that's okay. So if the last card of your deck is a smithy and you draw every card other than that smithy, not drawing the smithy hasn't cost you anything at all. In fact, in this case, it's actually good, because then you have the smithy for your next turn. It's probably good, so you have the smithy for your next turn, right? So what you really care about is drawing and playing your payload cards. Now, if the last card of your deck is a village and you need that village to play all your actions, because some of your payload is actions, then that could still be a problem. But really, you're just trying to make sure that you can draw and play your payload cards. So that's something to keep aware of. If you have a 5 payload card deck and no dead cards in it, no green cards in it, then you actually don't need any draw at all to draw your deck. And actually, drawing extra draw can, in this case, make your deck less reliable, right? If I have a 5 card deck, I'm for sure drawing it every turn. If I have a 5 card deck and I add 3 villages and 3 smithies to it, then my first 5 cards might be 3 smithies and no villages, and then the smithy can draw villages dead, and now I'm not drawing all my payload every turn. Even though I added 3 extra villages and I added 3 extra smithies, it's less reliable than if I didn't have them in it. So adding extra cards doesn't necessarily make it reliable. Now, basically, it's almost always going to, and having 5 or fewer cards is a really fringy edge case. You're also fairly unlikely to dud out in that deck of 5 payload cards, 3 villages, and 3 smithies, but it can happen, right? That's so that's something to keep in mind, and it leads to the next big point, which is to say, the bigger your deck gets in terms of dead cards that aren't contributing to your draw at all, the bigger your deck gets in terms of those, the less reliable your deck is going to be, even if you're adding a bunch of extra draw components to it. Unless you have some mechanic that is really ensuring your reliability as opposed to just adding more stuff to it, you're going to be in worse shape. So if I add 3 payload cards and I add 3 cards to the total draw of my deck's going to go down in reliability in almost every case, right? There's probably some edge cases where that's not true, but if I add a village and a smithy, the village and the smithy, that's going to be able to have me draw a net of 2 more cards. If I add 2 irrelevant cards to my deck that don't help me in drawing at all, but don't necessarily need an action either. So if I add a village, a smithy, and 2 silvers to my deck is less reliable than it was before. So the bigger your deck gets, the less reliable it's going to be. That doesn't necessarily mean don't make a bigger deck, but you have to realize that the bigger your deck is, the longer that you're trying to push things, the more likely it is that at some point you're going to dud out, and or the more you actually need to be increasing your draw components more and more so. So that's kind of the second point there. The third point I'd like to make is that the most common way that you dud out is actually at the beginning of your turn. And for these kinds of village smithy things, and by village and smithy, I guess I should have pointed this out at the beginning. By village, I mean any card that gives you 2 actions back and draws a card. So farming village, mining village, village, workers village. I don't mean village necessarily at this point. We'll get to some of these others later. Cards that act like villages by letting you play multiple actions, which is the canonical definition of village. I meant specifically the card village, and cards that share the same draw characteristics as village. Since we're talking about draw reliability, I really probably should have said this starting at the beginning, but I didn't. So I apologize for that. And by smithy, I mean any card that's drawing you 3 cards, whether it's smithy or torturer does the same thing, Margrave. But I'm excluding here cards that give you some extra filtering effect. So farming village, technically a little bit better, makes you a little bit more reliable if you have any green cards or curses in your deck, because it will skip over them, so you're a little bit more reliable there. That math is a lot more complicated, though. I'm not going to talk about those cards exactly per se, but the general principles will usually still apply. Anyway, to go back to this concept that I was just talking about, at the start of your turn is the biggest chance for you to dud, and it's because you're missing a village. Yeah, basically that's it. If you look at the chance to dud at any given point, the biggest thing is what we talked about first, where you barely have enough draw, and so you're quite likely to miss that last smithy. So that's the biggest effect if you barely have enough draw. But once you have enough net draw where you're a little bit over, 1 or 2 over, your next biggest place to fail is the worst place for you to fail, and that's you don't have a village at the start. And this is particularly true if you've built your deck in such a way that you have just enough villages. So if you have 3 villages and 4 smithies, you're going to be in pretty bad shape to have that first village, unless 3 villages and 4 smithies is way overdraw. If it's just a tiny bit of overdraw, and you have just barely enough villages, you're going to be in trouble. Just barely enough villages for your smithies. So generally you want to add these villages first. You want to have at least as many villages as smithies, even though that gives you extra actions. And actually you want to have a slightly more villages than smithies. If for draw to be the most reliable, you usually have 1 more village than you have smithies, or once your deck gets to be big enough, it even goes to being 2 villages more than you have smithies. So that's a big deal, and this implies something about how you should be building some of these kinds of decks. You want to be having extra villages anyway, and so this encourages you to be playing with some amount of terminal action payload as well, as not just the draw, but some kind of payload that's terminal as well. Since you're going to have the villages anyway, then you might as well take advantage of that. Now, it doesn't, you don't have to. If there's absolutely no benefit towards having a terminal versus having a treasure or something, then don't get the terminal, because there is some chance that you can draw the action dead and have had enough villages to draw everything, but then you draw the village. And anyway, obviously it can work out as a negative against you, but because you should generally be building to have more villages than smithies anyway, it's relatively low cost to add that first terminal or the first few terminals, because it's the villages that you need to support them are really helping your reliability a lot anyway. So that's another big takeaway to take away. So the next thing that I want to talk about is what makes these kinds of things more or less reliable. Should you be going for bigger chunks and trying to do things with a smaller number of cards, like was kind of recommended earlier, or should you be going for smaller chunks? And so, what's the difference basically between going for a village smithy combination of cards to get your draw up versus village and moat versus village and hunting grounds versus lab and lab versus festival and smithy or festival and hunting grounds, or all of that, right? Basically, you are going to be, if you have the same amount of net draw in your deck, you're going to be more reliable the more each individual card is closer to each other, i.e., that is to say, the more, basically, the smaller amount of draw is coming from each individual card, and the more reliable you're going to be. So village smithy is more reliable than village moat if you have the same net draw from villages and smithies as you have from villages and moats. The same, village support, you have extra villages, whatever. Obviously, the smithy is going to draw you more cards than the moat, so if you have the same number of smithies versus moats, I have 4 villages and 4 smithies, that's going to be more reliable than having 4 villages and 4 moats, obviously, because you're drawing more cards. But if, so 4 smithies net you 8 cards. To have enough moats to net you 8 cards, you need 8 of them. If you have 8 smithies or if you have 4 smithies and 4 villages versus 8 moats and 8 villages, the 8 village, 8 moat deck is going to be much, much, much more reliable. And that's just because you're going to be a lot more likely to have your first village in any given hand, or your first moat in any given hand, because they're proportionally more of your deck than the cards that you're trying to draw, your payload cards, your dead cards. So the smaller chunks that do less each time, but you have more of them, is going to be more consistent. Additionally, we can look at the other axis. So lab and lab, that's again closer to each other than village and smithy, but they are, lab and lab are duplicated with each other. They're more redundant. They're similar, right? You're closer to the average card because they're literally exactly the same as each other than you are with village and smithy. Even though you're drawing the same number of cards, the village and smithy is less reliable than lab and lab. And this is just because with village and smithy, you need the village first and then the smithy. But with lab and lab, you just need to have one of them first, and then you're more likely to be able to get the next one because your hand size is already bigger. So lab and lab is actually much, much more reliable than village and smithy. And if you have enough labs to just barely draw your deck, then you're going to be able to, just exactly the right number of labs. You're still usually going to be able to draw your deck over 50% of the time. And once you get to labs, if you're overdrawing by 1, you're like 90% or somewhere in that area to be able to draw your deck. You're a lot more reliable. Whereas with village and smithy, you need to be able to overdraw some. You need the extra villages like we talked about before. So that smaller chunk is a lot better. And this becomes even more pronounced when we talk about festival or any other card that isn't drawing you cards, as it gives you that village effect. Festival is a lot less reliable than village in trying to be able to draw your deck. And again, some of it's the same principle as before, as we talked about moving from lab to moving to village and smithy. If you move to festival and hunting grounds, that draws you the same number of cards still, or festival and council room, same thing, right? That still draws you, it still is taking 2 cards, and you're netting the same amount of cards as you would with village and smithy. You're netting 2, you're netting 2, you're netting 2. In all of these cases, your hand size is increasing by 2. But with festival and hunting grounds, or Festival and Smithy, what have you, you're a lot less reliable because, well, right, if you look back at the math, when you played the Village, you had a 5-card hand from which to find your first Smithy. When you do it with Festival and Hunting Grounds, you only have a 4-card hand to find your first Hunting Grounds. And every festival that you play, you don't get to disclude it from the cards that you're looking to have, like other cantrips, in your deck size when you're looking for your Smithies, your Hunting Grounds, or your Moats. So it's just much less reliable. And in fact, it's so much less reliable that in some cases, even adding a card to compensate for the economy that the festival gives you. Obviously, the festival gives you 2 money, and so that's not nothing. But it's not that rare of a case to where adding a silver in, say, if I have Village and Smithy and silver, then this is equivalent card net-wise to Festival and Smithy. But adding those silvers in as dead cards, you can still be more reliable in drawing your deck than if you would have had the Village or the Festival, right? Village and silver can often still be more reliable than the Festival once your deck gets to be very big. This isn't to say that festivals can't still be useful in these kinds of things. They are an action. They are a village effect. They do give, the money and the buy in the case of festival itself, but they're a lot less reliable than having the village split. Split? That's not the right term. Villages as your village support, villages that draw you cards. So that's another big thing to do with reliability there. The last thing I want to mention is just because your decks are so unreliable at being able to draw themselves, right? For instance, I'll give a little bit of numbers here. If you have 8 stop cards in your deck, this doesn't seem like that much for payload or what have you. If you have 8, then you're only hitting 50% to draw your deck, or so. If you have this 3, you're barely getting over 50% if you have 3 villages and 3 smithies. So that's not that reliable, right? Once you get up to, say, 6 and 4, you're only about 80%. 6 villages, 4 smithies, 8 stop cards. You're way overdrawing there, but you're still slightly under 80%. So you're not that reliable if you're just jamming villages and smithies into your deck. This is my point. If you're just jamming more cards to help you draw into your deck, you're not increasing your reliability by all that much. So what can you do about it, right? That's the last question I want to tackle today. And there's a lot of different things that you might be able to do. Some of it is coming down to the cards. So like I said, farming village helps you a little bit with your reliability before. And that's true. Now that's a pretty minor effect because you probably don't have too many green cards or curses in your deck. So the extra reliability gives you is, well, not nothing, not totally negligible. It's not very big. But there are other drawing cards that help your consistency a lot more as they do these effects. So the biggest and best example is Wandering Minstrel. If you're drawing all of your actions first, and Wandering Minstrel helps promote that pattern, then you are going to be much, much, much less likely to dot out because you're always going to keep hitting that next action card. And so if you just replace all of your villages with Wandering Minstrels, okay, you still might miss your first village and you might miss your first draw card, but on all the subsequent ones, you need to have such a long string of dead cards in a row that it's very unlikely for you to miss. And in particular, it's going to be very unlikely for you to dud multiple turns in a row because, again, you're skipping those dead cards. Even if you miss one turn, then the next turn you're probably going to have a lot of actions in your hand, right? Because you've played a Wandering Minstrel. Actually, this is generally true in these kinds of decks, that you're correlated in such a way that it makes you less likely to dud multiple turns in a row. The way it would happen would be if you get all of your villages in one hand and all of your smithies in the next, but this is pretty unlikely. And so the correlation makes it such that if you've dud one turn, you're generally less likely to dud the next turn. For the average dud, right? There is the catastrophic dud where you got all of your villages and all of your smithies, and they don't come together, and so then you dud. But typically you're not going to dud those multiple turns. You should plan, if you can, to be able to dud once. You can still sometimes do things when you dud, right? It's not, oh, I can do 0 this turn. It's, I can only buy one useful thing this turn. So keep that in mind. You can still buy a useful thing often. The filtering effect of cards, Wandering Minstrel is just the best, especially from the village side, but from the smithy side, right, Catacombs is going to help somewhat. Journeyman is going to help a little bit because you can skip some of these dead cards, and so that's going to make you more reliable. All of these things are going to help you make you more reliable. But the other big thing you can do is to seed your hand with a good card, so that you make sure that your next card, that your next hand at least has the first set of village or smithy or both in it. And so if you can do that, then that's fantastic. So ways you can do that: cards that when you gain a card, it goes to the top of your deck. So you draw your whole deck, you have a royal seal in place, and you can top deck. Or if you have a watchtower in hand, you can top deck a village and a smithy that you buy, as you then also add your money components, your payload. That's going to help you a lot, because you're going to make sure that you have the first village and the first smithy, and so then you're going to be, it's like I talked about before, the first village is the hardest to get, the first smithy is the hardest to get, unless you're just barely drawing your deck, in which case it's the last one. But usually you want to be overdrawing at least a little bit. But also, because you want to be overdrawing, if you can build your deck to be overdrawing a lot, and can find some way of taking advantage of that. Jake and Adam discussed this in one of the main episodes a while back. That is something that is also viable. So if you can convert your extra draw into payload, whether it's by gain and play tricks, or whether it's by having cards that can function as either draw or payload, so like Steward can draw you cards, or it can be money if you've already drawn your deck. King's Court you can apply to a drawer, or you can apply to a payload card, depending on whether you need to draw more or not. Things like that, cards which can perform multiple functions, those also help with your reliability, because they're draw when you need them to be draw, but you're not wasting that draw by having them not able to be payload when they need to be payload. Obviously, King's Court is just bonkers anyway, so maybe not the greatest example, but Throne Room or something, that's a similar thing. Gain and play, things like that. So those are some things that you can help to do to have your reliability. You can overbuild, that helps somewhat too. But in general, right, it depends on the game in question. So sometimes you can take the time to overbuild. Sometimes you're playing a really close mirror and you just don't have the opportunity, and right, you can't waste the time overbuilding. But you have to judge, how long am I going to be trying to go with a deck like this? It might be worth it to overbuild to prevent duds later on, because the dud later on, right, that's going to be a wasted turn, just like you buying extra drawing stuff now could be a wasted turn. And so that's something to be thinking about. Usually that's not going to come up so much, but if you have a feel, or especially if you can afford to do the math to know you're likely to dud more than once, then it's usually worth building more.
I'm doing a cleanse.
Yeah.
It's like a colon cleanse, but
Yeah.
for Dominion.
It's like a colon cleanse, but for Dominion.
Yeah. So I've been playing a lot of Overwatch and Sekiro Shadows Die Twice, and sucking at both of those, which is great, because I get to take a break from sucking at Dominion.